Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Perry with the Circle of Atonement here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are talking about what is a holy encounter. Holy encounters is the topic of the workshop we're hosting next weekend for our 30th anniversary celebration in Sedona. And so what Robert and I thought we'd do today is offer a preview of that workshop because there are live stream tickets available for the weekend. So if you want to join us for the Circle's 30th anniversary, you can do so from wherever you are in the world. If you like, you can find the tickets at circleofa.org/Sedona. And we hope that you will join us because it's going to be a very special weekend. It's our first live event in 5 years. And we not only have the Holy Encounters workshop, but we also have a concert from Netta Boyne, and we'll be honoring those who have contributed to the Circle's journey over the last 3 decades. So it's going to be a wonderful time. If you can't make the live stream live, no worries. Everyone who purchases a ticket will receive the recording, so you won't miss a thing. And again, you can get tickets at circleofa.org/Sedona. Today is going to be a shorter conversation than we normally have because we don't want to give too much of the workshop away. But I think it's worth starting with why we picked this topic of holy encounters for the anniversary weekend. Obviously, there is just an ocean of topics that you can choose from in the course, but this one stood out to us because number one, it's just so beautiful. And two, because the world is feeling so isolated. We are more connected than we've ever been through our technology, and yet we've never felt more alone. There's an epidemic of loneliness that we keep hearing about all around the world. The pandemic has made us feel more alone. And on top of that, our spiritual practices can make us feel alone. And so when we started talking about this idea of do our spiritual practices make us feel alone, we thought, okay, there's a good topic to discuss for our anniversary weekend. And the reason why our spiritual practices can make us feel alone is that we tend to view spirituality as a solitary individual act. We tend to think that to be spiritually advanced is to pull ourselves apart and dedicate ourselves to God. And this is how we experience spiritual growth in some form of isolation. But that's not the course's approach. And so we're looking forward to getting into this idea through the weekend. So Robert, do you want to say anything more about that idea of holy encounters and spirituality and isolation versus in encounters?
Yeah, I'll just echo what you said. It really, if you think about our classic image of spirituality, of spiritual development, of reaching spiritual heights, we tend to think of it in in images of being solitary, right? You think of Buddha under the Bodhi tree, you think of Tibetan monks in caves, you think of Christian mystics having mystical revelations, you think of some perhaps spiritual giant or highly developed spiritual person by themselves having a powerful interior experience. And so if we're thinking about, spirituality in general and thinking about trying to develop and ascend and reach heights, that's our main image.
Right. And we want to be clear that the course affirms both models. And we were saying earlier that perhaps one of the best encapsulations of this affirmation of both sides is in the supplement, The Song of Prayer. And in the Song of Prayer supplement, there's this ladder of prayer. And it's the idea that our journey up to God has these two sides. One side is what you've labeled the mystical ascent, which is that more solitary, individual, spiritual journey. And then there's this other side that's interpersonal joining. And so on our journey home to God, both of these things are operating in tandem, But yeah, I heard Marianne Williamson say a few years ago that relationship is the next great spiritual frontier. And I have totally latched on to that idea because I think it's so true. If we can just learn how to get along, then we can heal our relationships and in turn we can heal our world. I know you're always trying to like get me back over to that mystical ascent side of the ladder where there is a solitary journey to it as well, but there's this relational journey, and so much spiritual growth can happen in relationship, as we well know. It's a different model of spiritual development, one that I don't think has quite infused into the culture as much as it should. But man, it's such a beautiful idea that our spiritual development comes in a relationship with each other.
Yeah, I think it's really important to affirm both sides. I mean, the Course, abundantly affirms the mystical ascent side. It talks so much about internal practices where it's expecting profound shifts to take place. It talks about having experiences of oneness with God that change our whole trajectory. At the same time, while the Course affirms that mystical ascent side that is so present traditionally, it also affirms this side that is not particularly associated with spiritual development. And that is the importance of human encounters, interpersonal encounters. And I think, however much they may not be part of the traditional recipe, I think we know that they can have tremendous power. If we just look at our own experience, I think we can see that. We've all probably had moments, some unexpected interaction with somebody else where something happened that we didn't plan for, um, but felt very real, that may have changed our lives, that may have changed us on the inside. So I think we only have to look at our own lives and realize that while, yes, there is power in those private moments of spiritual experience, there is huge power in interactions with other people, encounters.
So you're dancing on the edges of a definition of holy encounters. And we don't want to give too much away, but let's get into specifically what they are.
Okay. The term is not used very often in the Course. I count 7 times in which the term is used or kind of used. Like there's a place where it says that makes the encounter holy. Well, we can count that one, but 7 times is practically nothing. So even though it's not a main term in the Course, the concept occurs all over the place. And what is that concept? My favorite quote, I think, is this one from the manual, where it's this manual section 3. And it says, even at the level of the most casual encounter, it is possible for two people to lose sight of separate interests, if only for a moment. And we'll talk more about the whole separate interest thing. But notice that there's an encounter between two people, and both of them are losing sight of separate interests. Both of them are stepping out of their egos and experiencing some kind of joining. It's another passage in the text, chapter 13, and it says the sharing of salvation, and says that makes the encounter holy. So what makes the encounter holy is the sharing of salvation. So one person gives salvation in some form, and it can look very, secular, very ordinary. And then the other person receives that and returns it, and it's shared. There's some kind of sharing between people of salvation, which sounds in different language very much like the two people losing sight of separate interests. So in each case, you have a moment, an interaction in which both people kind of step out of their usual separateness.
Right. Let's get into that idea of stepping out of your separate interests, because that's a really intriguing idea. And it's such an important theme in the Course that the Course even says that the sole qualification of a teacher of God is that somehow, somewhere, he made a deliberate choice in which he did not see his interests as apart from someone else's. And I've always kind of latched onto that idea, like that's the sole qualification of a teacher of God, is you don't see someone else's interests as separate from your own. And here it is, a qualification for a holy encounter as well. So it's a beautiful spiritual idea, but let's talk about what it looks like in practice.
Yeah, I mean, what just to put a slightly finer point on it, it's not just that you don't see someone else's interest as apart from your own. All you have to do is make a single deliberate choice in which, in that moment, you don't see that person's interest as apart from your own. So it must be a very, very powerful thing if that's the qualification. And it must be a less ordinary or usual thing than we might think if so much follows from that one choice.
Oh,
So
that's
anyway,
interesting. So it's not
yeah.
even that you have to see someone else's interests as not being separate from your own. It's that you just have to decide to do that. Hmm.
Yeah, you make a single deliberate choice in which in that moment, in that situation, you don't see that person's interest as apart from yours.
Wow.
Yeah. So that term which we keep saying over and over again, interests, I think we need to kind of park on it a bit. I've given it a lot of thought over the years. Uh, and it's the key to this whole idea of a holy encounter. Now, the word interests in this context has nothing to do with, oh, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in this thing. It's a different definition that's either the second or third in most dictionaries. And it has to do with what brings gain or loss to you. Okay, it has to do with benefit. So I found one dictionary definition that defines it as advantage or benefit. And I'll give you a couple examples of the usage of the word in this context, because we all know this usage, even though it's not the main one you think of in relation to the word interest. So, one example is it's in your interest to keep silent. Okay, you can imagine that being said, and we know what that means. It means it's to your advantage, it's to your benefit to keep silent. Here's another example. The judge decided that it would be in the best interests of the child to continue living with her mother. We know what that means. It would be to the advantage of the child, it would be to the benefit of the child to continue to live with her mother. So that's when we say separate interests, we're really talking about the perception that what benefits me may not benefit you, that my gain might actually be in conflict with your gain. That's why we like talking about a win-win, right? Because so often in the world, one person wins and another person loses.
And that's just what we call living in this world. It that
Right.
tends to be the lens through which we view everything. Does this work for me? Does this not work for me? And on our walk yesterday, you and I were talking about how these moments when someone puts someone else's interests above their own are among the most inspiring things that happen here on earth. When we see a part of a movie that touches us deeply, it's probably because something like this is going on.
I've been thinking about this for years because first I got the concept from the course of, you know, possible for two people to lose sight of separate interests. And the more you watch life with that concept in your mind, and like when you watch movies or there's a lot of real life stories, and you see the things that really touch you about some human interaction. And in my experience, almost always those things that really touch me, they touch me because they contain this idea. And basically, it's I treat your gain as my own, even when it looks like my loss, or I identify more with your gain than I do with what is typically counted as my own. Those moments, they are the best.
And you have to get to a place where you really truly identify the other person's gain as your own, or it can just seem like self-sacrificial. It just seems like
Absolutely.
you're giving them something and then you don't have it anymore. You have to make that switch in your mind where their gain is your gain, or the resentment is just going to build up, right?
Right. And we call it sacrifice. That's what we typically call this in our culture. But what the course would say is if you're doing it right, if this is the real thing, then you're sacrificing interests that are not really your own best interests. You're actually serving your own best interests by so identifying with their interests. So we may call it sacrifice, but the course would see you sacrifice nothing real. You've actually served your interests.
And that's really among the highest forms of love. It's when you love someone so much that you want what is best for them, even if it looks like a sacrifice for you. I've always had this idea in my head of I want to love bigger than anything that comes and goes. And what I think of when I think of that is I just want what's in the highest good of all. And if it means that I'm not getting exactly what I want in this moment, then that's just going to have to be okay because the love is what needs to win in the end. So,
And that's how you really serve your interests.
right, loving bigger than what comes and goes means that if it's not meant for me, then I won't have it. And so loving bigger is the reward in and of itself. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've been thinking of holy encounters in this very big idea of this is what we do. This is the kind of love that we have for the people who are the most important in our lives. And another thing that you've been trying to like pull me down on is that holy encounters can happen in the most casual ways. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how holy encounters are really can be very, very basic and simple, and have we can have them with strangers even throughout our day.
Yeah. Interestingly, you really do see that in some of the personal guidance to Helen and Bill, where, Jesus says, well, I gave this thing to Bob the elevator man to say to you on the elevator. He's trying to arrange holy encounters in very ordinary circumstances. And this comes through super clearly in the Manual for Teachers, section 2, or section 3, actually, where he's talking about what seem to be very casual encounters. And he lists 3 of these: a chance meeting of 2 apparent strangers in an elevator, a child who is not looking where he is going, running into an adult by accident, 2 students who happen to walk home together. He says, first of all, they're not chance encounters, they've been arranged. And we'll talk about more about that in Sedona. But they've been arranged for a potential for what might happen there. And here's the potential for each of those 3 encounters. He says, perhaps these seeming strangers in the elevator will smile to one another. Totally ordinary. Perhaps the adult will not scold the child for bumping into him. Also totally ordinary. Perhaps the students who walked home together will become friends. So there's nothing overtly spiritual at all. Those kinds of encounters are available to anybody of any religion or spiritual path. It's available to atheists. They are, in a way, extremely ordinary.
And the idea is that when we meet people, something was by design, even at the most casual level. And we can make any encounter that we have with anyone holy by just not seeing their interests as separate from our own. It depends on how we see them. If we see them as equal to us, as holy with us, then our behaviors become more loving and something passes between us in those moments. Is that a good way to think about them?
Yeah, something passes between, and it passes back and forth. It becomes mutual. Although I
Right.
just want to add in, I just want to add in, we were out talking about this on a walk yesterday in a public park, and we were getting blown away by the ideas, but then we're thinking, okay, everybody who passes us on this path, you know, that's been arranged. There's a potential there. And how do we maximize that potential? So it's really interesting to be talking about all this while out having these apparent chance encounters with people.
Well, that's what I was getting at without going into the story is we were at a park and people were passing us and I was saying to you, so if I smile at that guy that was all arranged and this was like my holy encounter with him, and it was like, yeah, somehow on some level every interaction is arranged and it has a potential to be holy. In fact, the reason why the interaction has been arranged is because it has the potential to be holy. And that's a
Yeah.
mind blowing thing.
Yeah.
But we can't get into the intricate
Yeah.
details of all
Yeah.
of that. But one important thing to keep in mind is that it does take two people to have a holy encounter. So if it's one person just putting someone else's interests or not seeing someone else's interests as separate from their own, then they qualify as a teacher of God, and that's a great thing. But two people doing that at the same time is what makes a holy encounter. And so
Right.
let's talk
Right.
a bit more about that idea that it takes two.
Yeah. So the course isn't in any way downplaying or denigrating when something of significance happens in one of those two people. So one of those two people could decide that they won't see separate interests and they'll make a choice that reflects that. One of those two people could have their own holy instant in that moment, what the course calls an out of pattern time interval. But it's when it then is received and given back and then shared between the two that it becomes a holy encounter. A holy encounter involves that mutuality.
That's a beautiful idea that both sides are affirmed. If you're not seeing someone else's interests as separate from your own, that's good. That makes you a teacher. But if both of you have this going on, then there's the encounter. And
Right.
it's a beautiful idea to think the goal should be both, right? To
Yeah.
be teaching, but also to be experiencing these with other people. Now, you've
Interestingly,
always
just as an aside here, in that section, the manual that talks about a teacher of God, has made this single deliberate choice to not see someone else's interests as apart from his own. What the manual says is that it portrays it as a solitary experience. But then what happens is this signal goes off in the minds of that teacher's assigned pupils. They start to look for him. They end up coming to the right place at the right time. And now they have that encounter.
That's amazing. That's a whole other podcast. Like when you're ready, signals go off in the minds of others who seek to find you
Yeah.
for a holy relationship. But just getting back to this idea of individual versus joint encounters, if you have an individual moment where you're not seeing someone else's interests as separate from your own, number one, that qualifies you as a teacher. That's what we're saying. But it also qualifies as a holy instant. When it just happens to you,
Mm-hmm.
then it's a holy instant. But if it happens to both of you at the same time and something goes between you, that's the encounter. And I think, as well, I know as course students, we tend to spend the bulk of our time thinking about holy instants. And again, that goes back to the idea of viewing spirituality as this more individual thing. Why is it that we hear so much about holy instants in the course community, but not as much about holy encounters? So, do you want to paint some
Sure.
distinction between those
Sure.
two things?
Well, I think the simplest thing to say is a holy encounter is a joint holy instant. And as I said earlier, the term holy encounter is not used that much in the course, but the holy instant is discussed for chapters in the text. And if you track all those mentions, you'll find that some of those mentions are shared holy instants, joint holy instants. The most well-known one is in chapter 18, where it's talking about two people in a holy relationship, basically experiencing conflict. And the idea is that whoever is saner, and a lot of course students know this passage, whoever is saner at the time, what they're meant to do is ask for a holy instant for themselves. I mean, the line is, desire this holy instant for myself, that I may share it with my brother, whom I love. It is not possible for me to have it without him or him without me, yet it is wholly possible for us to share it now. So the idea is one person asks for a holy instant so that that can become a shared holy instant between them in which their conflict evaporates. And so there is a really explicit example of the course urging a shared holy instant. It starts out as private, one person initiates it, but then it becomes joint, and that's the holy encounter.
That's so good. And actually, what you're saying just reminds me that maybe one of the reasons why we focus so much on holy instance as course students is because the term holy instant appears very frequently in the course, and holy encounters doesn't appear so much. I think there's 7 references to holy encounters. Is that
Mm-hmm.
right? In the
Yeah.
course? Yeah. But this idea of you can make a holy instant, a holy encounter by saying that prayer or asking for it in the moment, that is incredible. And then the course says in another passage that think what the joining of two brothers really means. The room becomes a temple. Now that's exciting. Um, so if you're in a conflict with someone and you ask for a holy instant yourself where you can kind of get out of the conflict, get above it, and then you share that, you have a holy encounter with them where they're now joining you in that holy instant, and then the room becomes a temple. Now, I get kind of like overly excited about these kinds of things because I get excited about when people can get along. I think that's why I'm a course
Yeah.
student. It's like
Yeah.
I'm very invested in what it is for people to get along because I think the inability to get along is what's tearing everything apart. So this idea of the relationship can become the room becomes a temple, the relationship becomes a temple. If only we could think of our relationships this way. We are so casually hurtful to each other, but we wouldn't do that if we really understood, number one, who it is that we're talking to. You know, they're God's creations too, and what relationship really means for their development and for our own.
Yeah. And I just want to draw out, that's a favorite passage of mine, The Room Becomes a Temple. I just want to draw out what that is meaning in its context. It's from the psychotherapy supplement. And the notion is that can happen in a therapy session. In fact, that the psychotherapy supplement says that ideally psychotherapy is a series of holy encounters in which brothers meet to bless each other. So the notion is you're with your therapist, right? Or you're a therapist with your patient or client, and everything's going along as normal, and suddenly you fall into this place where there's something happening between you. Um, and And in that place, that passage says, nothing can be remembered of the world of guilt. The normal world is forgotten. Um, and it says, healing is done, for what is perfect needs no healing. You're together seeking healing. And suddenly in that moment, it feels like, what is there to heal? Healing is done. This is perfection. And so to think about just some ordinary, I mean, how many therapy sessions take place, every day? Some ordinary therapy sessions stumbling into this territory where suddenly the room becomes a temple. It's a beautiful
But
image.
Yeah, and it has and it's amazing to apply that to a therapist patient relationship, but we should be applying it to every relationship. I mean, what if you're with your child or your spouse or your friends or your colleagues and you're thinking the same thing? This office can become a temple. This home can become a temple. How could we not get significantly bumped forward in our spiritual development if we think of everything in this way?
Yeah, this elevator.
Right. Yeah. So, do you want to say anything more about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, we again, we're trying to walk this tightrope where we don't say too much about the weekend because people are coming a long way to be part of the workshop. But we've already said that in the course, this is not just something inspiring. This is something that moves us forward on our spiritual journey. And probably the most powerful passage about that comes very early in the text in chapter 1, where he's talking about it in terms of the miracle. But the miracle in the course is meant to be one person expresses love, and ideally that becomes a holy encounter. And so he says the miracle introduces an interval from which the doer, the miracle giver, and the receiver both emerge much farther along in time than they would otherwise have been. It says it substitutes for learning that might have taken thousands of years. Both people get bumped forward potentially thousands of years through one encounter. And then it says it does this by the underlying recognition of the perfect equality and holiness between the doer and receiver on which the miracle rests. So they're both realizing we're equals. They're both realizing we're both holy. And that recognition that they share is what can catapult them forward thousands of years on their journeys.
Yeah, it always kind of is mind blowing to me when the Course talks about saving ourselves thousands of years on our spiritual journey, especially when it applies that to very mundane things like one encounter or one practice period that you do in the workbook. It's kind of wild to think about. But in
Yeah.
terms of like our the everyday practicality of this message, I wanted to share an example from a few years ago when I was working on something here at the circle and was completely at loggerheads with someone else who was here. And we were forced to get to work together because we both really cared about this project. But this person and I had completely parted ways in terms of not only what we saw as the best solution, but real personality differences as well. And so we were kind of forced to be together, but real fundamental solid differences on a lot of layers. And so the emails and the interactions between us started to get more and more contentious until one day I just said to her, I was like, this is not going to work unless we make every single interaction that we have holy ground. And that means every email needs to be wrapped in love. And it's not that we don't say the things that we feel need to be said, it's that we take great care with each other and view the relationship itself as sacred. And what happened is for a time when we were both doing that, everything worked really, really well. And then we just started to slip. I was telling you that it went from, okay, we're going to do this. And then each interaction was loving. And then it went to this intermediary period where it was like, I can't really say this with love. So I'm just going to say it. And then like you can just feel like it's sliding.
Things are
And then
slipping.
it just fell off altogether. Because once you start in that zone of, I can't really say this gently. So I'm just going to say it, then it's like, uh-oh. But for that time, when we were looking at each other as like, you're sacred, this space between us is sacred, and we're going to take great care of it. That worked, and it was beautiful. And I was saying to you that if we could just have that filter with everyone and everything, then gosh, how different would the world be? How different would we be? But how much more advanced would we be on our own spiritual journey if we could do that?
Yeah. I mean, I think holy encounters, I think they're God's plan to save the world. But anyway, what I wanted to say that I love you making that connection between holy ground and holy encounters, because there are a few. I mean, holy ground is not a common term in the course. There's like 7 references to it or 6, and it too is not very common. But about 3 of those places where the course talks about holy ground or holy place, um, it's clearly a holy encounter image. What makes the ground holy in that passage is 2 people. One person gives salvation, the other person receives it and returns it, and there is a joining. And in fact, one of the most well-known quotes from the course, deservedly so, is basically about that. It says, "The holiest of all the spots on earth is where an ancient hatred has become a present love." And in the context of that section, that's mutual. It's 2 people experiencing that. So if we can imagine, like when we're talking about these holy encounters, which can be very ordinary, it can be in the elevator, it can be the students walking home together, we should imagine they are standing on holy ground. What a beautiful idea.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you were preparing, or you are preparing now for the 30th anniversary celebration and the workshop on holy encounters, you were saying that you hadn't really done a study on holy encounters, in part because, I don't know, you haven't really had an opportunity to, but also because the phrase holy encounters hadn't appeared so much, so you didn't take it as seriously. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't want to like speak for you, but you were pulling together words that connected with holy encounters, and the words that you were pulling were meeting and together and joining. And in the process of pulling those words alongside holy encounters, you got this more full picture. But you and I were talking about, because I've always thought of holy encounters in relation to the ground. And so thinking about, okay, the ground on which we stand is holy. And I'm going to view all of this ground and the space between you and me as holy. And that gave you a new picture of holy encounter. And that was fun
Yeah, yeah.
too.
I mean, I feel a bit thick that I hadn't made that connection, but it's a totally valid connection, and it really lifts the holy encounter concept to a somewhat new place, which I'm very
Yeah.
excited about for the weekend.
And I was joking with you because in the bags that every attendee in Sedona gets, on the back of them, it says, "Teach peace with me and stand with me on holy ground." And I was looking at you like, what do you think that meant? like, why
I
do you
just
think
thought
we
you
had?
liked that quote, and it's from the Circle of Atonement section, you know?
That's true. It is. But yeah, we've had some fun with that. So, Robert, I know that we don't want to give away too much of the weekend, but is there anything that you want to say in relation to a tiny sneak peek of what you're going to be covering during our time in Sedona?
Yeah, there's so much to be said about this concept, both theoretically and practically. You were talking about the research I've been doing. It's a rich concept. So we'll talk about the concept in more depth than we have. We'll talk about why it's so spiritually significant from the course's point of view, what the course says about that. We're going to bring in near-death experiences and how much they feature the importance of what the course calls holy encounters. We'll talk about the mindset we need to bring into our every single encounter with people. We'll talk about how to see the other person, how to treat the other person, the essential message to give the other person, within the form of our words and our behavior, what's the essential message we're giving them? And we'll talk about the results of all that, which is meant to be a mutual joining and what comes out of that. So we're going to to start with the concept, what it is and why it's so important, and then go into a lot of how to with a lot of exercises along those lines.
Okay, you are nowhere near done with the
No,
concept
it's
because
true.
you've got 3 full days to present on Holy Encounters in Sedona next weekend. And as I said at the top of the episode, we do have live stream tickets available. You can join us from wherever you are in the world if you go to circleofa.org/Sedona. And if you can't join us live, once again, you will get a recording of all the broadcasts, so you won't miss a thing. And we hope to see you in Sedona, either in person or online. Thanks so much for listening to our Holy Encounters preview, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.